Welcome back, everyone. Now we're going to learn how to manage the licensing process, alcohol, food, health, and anything else in a large-scale transaction. Presenting this topic today is the premier thought leader in this space, Elizabeth DeConti. Elizabeth is a shareholder in the Gray Robinson law firm. She offices in their Tampa office, but she has a national practice focusing on the alcohol and food industries. Elizabeth has been management counsel for numerous transactions involving hundreds to thousands of units, and she has a great deal of experience in licensing, regulatory compliance, trade practices, and industry litigation. Please welcome Elizabeth DeConti.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. What I want to talk to you about today is how to manage a licensing process in a large-scale acquisition. And this presentation today applies to those of you who are only managing what I call food and ancillary licenses, and those of you who are adding liquor licenses to that menu as well. So this is relevant if you're acquiring chains of restaurants, gas stations, convenience stores, grocery stores, pizza parlors, hamburger joints, you name it. Any restaurant with numerous licenses, I think that the information here will be helpful for you today. Next slide, please. So when we're involved in an acquisition, frequently our firm has been asked to work side by side with corporate counsel or even as managing counsel for an entire transaction when we're working on transitioning a business with numerous outlets which have numerous licenses each. And it can be a very challenging task to get all this done in a timely manner, especially when all of the licenses live in different jurisdictions because the outlets are all in different jurisdictions. So what are the goals in a transaction like this? First of all, having everything be seamless to the public is very important. We want the licensing transitions and transfers and new licenses, if needed, to time with the closing so we don't have any interruptions in service. We want to make sure that the seller who's transitioning these properties over to us keeps everything in good standing before handing over the properties to us. And we need to really take a hard look at whether there are any open issues with regard to the seller's licenses that we need to resolve. Those could be tax delinquencies or violations, administrative litigation of various kinds. All those will hold up the timely transition. And so we need to act on those issues and resolve them right away. Next slide, please. So how do you structure due diligence for this type of transaction? When I tell people about circumstances in which I've become the management counsel for an entire corporate transaction, it happens because managing the due diligence for these licenses is very time consuming and really critical to the effective transition of the business. And what I always tell people is that this really requires a lot of advanced planning and time. And there's that old expression that we're all familiar with. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And that's exactly true in this situation because there are so many moving parts to deal with. So the easiest way to begin is figure out when the desired closing date or dates may be. There could be multiple dates in a multifaceted transaction and work backwards from there. You're going to have to figure out how many licenses you have, whether they can be transferred or whether they have to be canceled and applied for from scratch. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And whether there are statutory or otherwise legal timeframes built in for how those licenses may transfer. We'll talk about that as well. There may be some mandated timeframes that you have to comply with. And finally, of course, you need to identify the government agencies overseeing the licenses, and there may be many of them. They can be on the state and, in fact, multiple local levels as well in some states, depending on where you are. Next slide, please. So here are some of the first things we need to figure out, the key questions, as I put it. First of all, as I just mentioned, does the jurisdiction require licensing on more than one level? You know, for liquor licenses, for example, there are several states which require this. Georgia is a good example, Colorado, Arizona. You really need to hone in on those local requirements. Frequently, the local transitioning procedures occur first, and then there's a state process, which occurs after. But all of those timelines will be different, and it's really necessary to nail those down at the outset. Does the jurisdiction allow a transfer, or will a new license be required? I suggest an analysis of which of these will be the most expedient for you. Most of the time, but not always, if you're able to transfer a license from one individual to another or one business entity to another, that can be simpler. But there are certain circumstances where it might be easier to start over again and simply apply for a new license. That analysis needs to be done ahead of time. And then finally, here's a reference to the additional timelines that I referred to. So for example, there could be a publication requirement. If you're applying for a liquor license, many jurisdictions require a sign posting to the public or in the newspaper or both for a certain number of days in advance of a decision being made on granting the license. If you fail to count those timeframes and adhere to them, you will not receive your license on time. And it's very important to factor in those deadlines when you're planning for your closing. We've had many people come to us sort of halfway through the process for help if things are late because someone either didn't realize that one of these prerequisites was here or didn't calculate the time correctly. Next slide, please. Other things you need to think about. So what do you do in a situation where there's just no way to avoid closing before you can get your license? Well, there are some circumstances where you can operate on a temporary license. And Florida is one of those states that issues temporary liquor licenses. For example, in the state of Ohio, they have something called an emergency authorization to operate letter that you can receive before your actual license arrives. And it's very important to understand if there are mechanisms like that that you can use. Another situation that you might be able to use, which depends on state law and policy and also depends on the relationship with the seller or the outgoing entity, is a management agreement, some sort of agreement that would allow the seller's employees to stay in place for a limited period of time using their license until your license is ready. And finally, we think about some issues related to that seamless transition and how can we make it easier? How can we make it go faster? Something I might suggest to you, which applies to food and alcohol licenses on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, is something we call a master file. So for example, if you had 30 or 40 outlets in one state, you would file one application with all of its corresponding parts, and then a reduced simplified application for all of the rest of the locations. I find that not only does this make a lot easier a project for you, for the buyer, it also creates an easier, more organized transition for the regulatory officials that you'll be dealing with. Remember, you can't always control the timeline of the government officials who will be processing all of your applications. And so anything that you can do to make their lives easier and the process less time consuming is a good thing. Next slide, please. So inevitably, there are things that people don't like about this process. They can't really be avoided. Here are a few things that trip people up. As I've said, this is a time-consuming process. We've received phone calls where, perhaps there was a corporate counsel who just hadn't dealt with a restaurant or a gas station closing before and didn't really realize that the licenses don't transfer automatically at the closing. So if you're late to the game, that can be a problem. Second, it's important to work carefully with corporate counsel on corporate records. So For example, Secretary of State, Department of State records need to match the new ownership structure that you are going to propose to regulatory officials for food, beverage, and ancillary licensing. If there are inconsistencies in those records or the timeline of the updating of the records isn't on par, you can have some of your license filings be rejected. So that's an important step to check off ahead of time. Finally, the subject we talk about frequently with regard to liquor licensing is fingerprinting. In a majority of cases, some level of fingerprinting and background check will be required for the directors and officers of the business when we're making a change. The requirements for that are going to vary, and they certainly will vary and may be more lenient if other licenses already exist with these same individuals on file. However, know that that is a part of the process that can be required and is time consuming, and so you want to build enough time for it. Next slide, please. So this is Murphy's Law. If something can go wrong, it will. And what I really mean by that is this is a numbers game. So my presentation today, really the advice and guidance that I'm giving is the same if you are absorbing 3 businesses or 3,000 businesses, right? But the more those numbers go up, the closer to 3,000 you get. Statistically, in the group, there will be some locations that have some problems, which will threaten your seamless timeline. So here are a few things that go wrong. You know, if there's a health inspection that's required for a food or a beverage license and we don't pass the inspection, that can cause a significant delay. Another example that I love to give people, similar to the health inspection, there will be a safety inspection or a fire inspection. If you have an exit light with a light bulb out, you're going to fail that inspection. If you have a smoke alarm with a battery that's out, you're going to fail that inspection. And sometimes it takes a while to not necessarily to make the repair, which is generally easy, but to get government back out to do the inspection again, and then to get their past inspection report where it needs to go so you can get your license. So all of these things can cause a delay. We spoke before about checking if the seller has a clean house. One of the most common problems we find when we do due diligence on properties that we're going to buy, if it's a restaurant or a pizza parlor or a gas station, whatever it is that there's a tax delinquency somewhere. Those tax delinquencies, depending on what they are, can be a little thorny to cure, but they really need to be cured because most jurisdictions will need you to get a tax clearance or a Department of Revenue clearance before you can transfer a license. So you don't want to own something that you can't have a license on just because the prior owner didn't pay their taxes. So that's an important thing to resolve ahead of time. And then this is sort of facetious, but it does happen, and it has happened to me before. When you need to fingerprint people, you need to make a plan for getting them in the right place at the right time. If they're on vacation in Paris, it might be hard for them to get fingerprinted. So remember to talk to these executives pretty far in advance, pretty early in the process, both to warn them that this is going to be coming and to make a plan, because most likely they're going to be very busy people, and that you may need to make some pretty far out arrangements to have them fingerprinted. Next slide, please. Be prepared. This is my mantra for today. Always give yourself a cushion of time. That's my advice, because as I mentioned, numbers are numbers, and statistically unforeseen issues are going to come up that you're going to have to resolve, and you want enough time to resolve those issues. And I can't really, to that end, I can't really emphasize enough the importance of having good rapport and relationships with agency contacts and regulators who will help you through this process, because there's really no way to resolve these kinds of problem issues without their help. And so, you know, over the years, we've been very fortunate that we've built and maintained a lot of these relationships, which are very, very just so valuable. You know, someone sitting inside the agency has the capacity to tell you, you know, I've been here for so many years and I know, you know, here's a good way that we can fix this when something like this happens. Let me suggest that we fix it this way. Having a good working relationship with those people is extremely important. Next slide. Thank you. We've had a short time today to talk about what could be a long subject for a long presentation, but I look forward to the opportunity to get together further as the course of the conference goes on, and I look forward to hearing your questions. And in the meantime, if you have any questions at all after you see this video, please feel free to give me an email at my email address here or a call. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Terrific info and insight as always. We'll look forward to your deeper dive. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and we'll talk soon.